Throughout the semester, we're going to be talking about various forms of psychopathology or psychiatric disorders. And the reality is that when we're talking about psychopathology, we're essentially describing a cluster of symptoms that, for whatever reason, have been defined as abnormal. The issue is that abnormal is a loaded term. At its most pure, abnormal means nothing more than deviating from what is normal or unusual. But in practice, when we think of things that are abnormal, we're usually referring to things that are different from the norm in undesirable or concerning ways. Given this, it's probably not surprising that the synonyms for abnormality include not only terms that are fairly benign, like unusual or rare, uncommon, or unrepresentative, but also terms like freak, irregular, divergent, or atypical, all of which have a negative valence. So we have to be careful in how we use the terms because the confounding of abnormality with deviance is one of the main things that underlies the stigma we see around mental illnesses. For this reason, psychologists have tried to bring a little bit more definitional clarity to the term abnormal and have come up with four main definitions of abnormality: deviations from social norms, statistical infrequency, failure to function adequately, and deviation from ideal mental health. And we'll go through these one at a time. The first of these definitions states that something can be considered abnormal when it deviates from social norms. And we can think of social norms as rules for behavior based on a set of moral and conventional standards determined by the dominant culture in a society. Now, this dominant culture part is a key piece of the definition, because one thing you have to remember is that what is considered normal by dominant members of a culture may not be considered normal by all members of a society. In other words, we have to remember that normality is culturally relative, but often that fact is overlooked and folks in power presume that instead normality is universal, that it's accepted by everyone, even when that's not true. So an obvious example of this is in terms of appearance. Now, in the dominant culture in the US, which is comprised predominantly of white, upper-class Christian principles, there are ideals of how people should look, or how people can brand themselves so that they'll be accepted by those in power. But because of this, anything that deviates from that norm ends up being considered abnormal, and in many cases, weird or wrong or even freakish. And it's not because different ways of presenting oneself are actually wrong or unhealthy or even inappropriate. It's just that folks in power have decided what is normal, and because they have power, can judge others according to that criteria. And certainly this applies to appearance, but it also has really big ramifications for how we judge people's behavior. And that's something we'll spend some time talking about in class, particularly in terms of how it relates to perceptions of mental health. Now, when we define abnormality based on whether or not a trait or behavior is in line with what is considered normal by a society, we're using the definition of deviation from social norms. The next definition of abnormality has to do with statistical infrequency. Basically, if something is proportionally rare. But in order to use this definition, we have to be clear about how rare a trait or behavior needs to be before it's classified as abnormal. So let's use the example of IQ. If we're using a standardized measure of IQ, we know that the average IQ in a given population is 100 points. And we also know that the further from 100 you look, the fewer people you'll find. So many fewer people have an IQ of 130 than 120, and many fewer people have an IQ of 120 than 110. And when we get to the extreme ends of the distribution is when we start to see what we would consider statistically rare traits. So a very unusual trait or behavior is defined as one that is more than 2 standard deviations, either above or below the mean. So in the case of IQ, either over 130 or under 70. And given this rarity, according to this definition, we would consider IQs in that range to be abnormal. The third definition we have of abnormality has to do with failure to function adequately. So according to this definition, a trait or behavior would be called abnormal if it inhibits a person's ability to cope with day-to-day living. Now, according to the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, which includes the diagnostic criteria for all mental disorders, there are two main things that would lead us to say that a trait or behavior is inhibiting a person's functioning. If it causes significant personal distress, or if it causes an impairment in social, occupational, or other important activities. So let's start with the personal distress pieces first. Now, according to the DSM-5, we would say that someone is experiencing significant personal distress if they are experiencing internal emotions or thoughts that are upsetting to the person, regardless of whether they can be observed by others. In this way, we say that distress is subjectively determined. So I can't tell you if you're experiencing distress to the extent that it's interfering with your functioning. Only you can determine that. The other thing that would lead us to say that a trait or behavior is inhibiting a person's functioning is if it's causing an impairment or in social, occupational, or other important activities. So according to this criteria, regardless of whether or not a person is experiencing distress, if their functioning is interrupted or diminished as a result of certain traits or behaviors, then we would call those traits or behaviors abnormal. Now, the final definition of abnormality is a little bit different from the rest, because rather than defining what is abnormal, some psychologists instead define what is normal or ideal and then judge anything that deviates from that as abnormal. But of course, this requires us to decide on the characteristics we consider necessary for mental health, and that's one of the things we'll spend some time doing in our next class. So in preparation for our next class, I want you each to come up with a list of characteristics you think a person needs to be mentally healthy. I'll see you soon in class.